Communism. Wow, what a word, right? It carries so much history, so much weight. But to really get what it's all about, we can't just jump into the theory. No, we have to go way back to the world that created it. A world of steam and steel and a whole lot of struggle. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to step into the brutal new world of the Industrial Revolution. Then we'll meet the two brilliant minds who saw it all happening. We'll dig into their big idea about history's great conflict. And finally, we'll see how that one idea went from a little pamphlet to a force that changed the entire globe. Okay, so let's set the scene. We're in 19th century Europe. And this isn't just a story about cool new inventions. No. For a lot of people, this was a time of massive and honestly super brutal change. Millions of people were being pulled from their farms into these new, smog-filled industrial cities. And your life was basically run by the factory whistle. Think about it. 14-hour shifts, it was just relentless. And it wasn't just adults working these crazy hours. We're talking about kids, some as young as 6 years old, working in incredibly dangerous mills and factories, just so their families could scrape by. And get this, there was zero safety net. If you got hurt on the job, say, you lost a hand in a machine, you weren't taken care of. You were just replaced. Your life was basically seen as just another disposable part of the machine. And this, right here, this really gets to the heart of the problem. I mean, just look at this. On one side, you have factory owners getting rich at a speed nobody had ever seen before. And on the other, the workers, who were often getting sick from the terrible conditions and dying young. This wasn't just a little gap in wealth. It was a massive chasm, splitting society into two new groups, the people who owned everything and the people who did all the work. Okay, so from all this chaos, two thinkers emerge. And they weren't just watching from the sidelines. They were trying to figure it all out. And they came up with an idea so radical, it would literally change the world. And here they are, an incredibly unlikely pair. You've got Karl Marx, the philosopher, the radical journalist, the guy who's all about big revolutionary ideas. And then you've got Friedrich Engels, get this, the son of a wealthy factory owner. He knew exactly how this system worked from the inside. You'd think these two would have nothing in common, right? But nope, they met in 1844 and hit it off immediately. See, Engels wasn't just some rich kid. He'd actually written this incredible, scathing book about how awful conditions were for the working class. And this is huge. He basically funded Marx for decades so Marx could actually do his writing. And together, they would create the Communist Manifesto. And that's something you've got to remember. The guy writing about poverty wasn't some professor tucked away in a university. He was living it. He was flat out poor, living in London, and the conditions were so bad that, tragically, some of his own kids died young. He was only able to keep going because of his friends' support. So, what was this earth-shattering idea they came up with? What was their big theory that came out of all this? All right, so here it is, their central idea, and it's a total game changer. They basically asked, what if we've been looking at history all wrong? What if it's not really about kings and queens and big ideas? They said, if you really want to understand why society is the way it is, you have to look at the economic nuts and bolts. Who owns the stuff and who makes the stuff? That's it. They called it historical materialism. And this quote from Marx, it sums it all up perfectly. He's basically saying, it's not your consciousness, your ideas, that determines how you live. It's the other way around. It's how you live, your economic situation, that determines how you think. Think of society like a building. This was their big analogy. The foundation, what they called the economic base, that's the economy. It's the factories, the land, the labor, and everything else, politics, law, culture, even art and religion, that's all the superstructure. It's the rest of the building, and its shape is completely determined by the foundation it's sitting on. And this is where it gets really bold. They looked back and said, you know what? This isn't new. This whole story of humanity, it's just one long history of class struggle. It was master versus slave, then lord versus serf, and in their time, it was owner versus worker. Just different names for the same core conflict. So in their world, in the industrial age, who were the two big players? Well, first, you had the bourgeoisie. These were the owners, right? The people who owned the factories, the machinery, all the capital. And then on the other side of the conflict, you have the proletariat. This was the giant new working class. They didn't own any factories or land. The only thing they had to sell just to survive was their ability to work. So there you have it. That's the main event for Marx and Engels. The bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. The owners versus the workers. But here's the kicker. Marx didn't see the workers as just victims. No, he saw them as the heroes of the story, the class that was actually destined to rise up, overthrow the whole system, and create something new. Okay, so that's the theory. But a theory is just words on a page, right? How did this idea actually leap out into the real world and, well, cause so much chaos? Well, the timing was frankly insane. They published the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and just a few weeks later, boom, Europe just explodes in a wave of revolutions. It was like they wrote the script for what was about to happen. Now, those first revolutions in 1848, they mostly fizzled out. But the idea was out there and it wasn't going anywhere. Fast forward to the 20th century, and leaders start using these ideas as the blueprint for their own revolutions, completely redrawing the map of the world, from Russia in 1917 to China in 49 to Cuba a decade later. But, and this is a huge but, this is where the story gets really complicated and frankly really dark. Because what happened in practice was often a million miles away from the original theory. You had leaders taking Marx's ideas and twisting them to fit their own agendas. And the result wasn't always freedom. In fact, it often led to incredibly brutal, repressive regimes. And defenders of Marx would argue that this is absolutely not what he would have wanted or predicted. Which brings us to one of the biggest, toughest questions of the last 100 years. How could a theory that started with the goal of freeing people from oppression end up creating governments that did the exact opposite? That massive gap between the idea and the reality, well, that's a whole other story.